Who's That I Hear, DJ Hill's first picture book for children. And hopefully there'll be many more picture books for children. I'm now going to introduce the participants. We'll then hear a reading of the book by DJ herself, followed by a short exchange back and forth. If we have time, we'll take in some questions from you, the audience. Either you can raise your hand or Alex will facilitate the chat feature, and we'll end with a book drawing. So DJ Hill, the author of Who's That I Hear, who's wearing the powder blue with the blonde hair, is a poet, freelance writer, mixed media artist, and writer of children's picture books. Her debut collection of poetry and collage, Homespun Mercies, won the New York City Big Book Award, the IBPA, which is the Independent Book Publishers Association Benjamin Franklin Award, the CIPA, that's Colorado Independent Publishers Association, EV Gold Medal, and the Silver Medal in the Nautilus and Independent Publisher Book Awards. The cover art was awarded the Spirit of the Suffragists Prize at the opening ceremony of Vote, a centennial celebration at the Loveland Museum in Loveland, Colorado. Her mixed media art has been exhibited at the R2 Gallery, Red Brick Center for the Arts, La Laguna Gallery, and Loveland. DJ is also the founder of Owlets and Company, which we'll talk about later, an interactive website dedicated to children's storytelling, games, and activities. She holds a BFA in creative writing from Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I work and where I met her. She writes, creates, and leads writing workshops from her home in Santa Fe. Julie Adrian, who has got the longer hair, blondish hair with a fire in the background. The book's illustrator is a visual artist who embraces color and simple, bold images in her painting, which you'll see as you look at the book. She is a lover of people and animals of all kinds. She is also a wedding officiant, leading ceremonies in Vail, Aspen, Steamboat Springs, Breckenridge, and surrounding areas. Julie lives in Vail, Colorado with her husband, Chris, and adopted pup, Rocker. And finally, Elisa, is it Onmak?
Yes.
Onmak, who's just nodded, who's in front of the books, is a graphic designer and creator of the business Light of the Moon Incorporated, which works with self-published authors, doing their book layout and design and helping to get their books in print. Elisa collaborated with DJ on Homespun Mercies, her award-winning book of poetry. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to the participants as well as the guests who are listening in. So before we talk about the nuts and bolts of the book and its publication, I would like DJ to read it, so you'll have a chance to experience the text and the beautiful illustrations yourself.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you to everyone for being here and our participants and our viewing audience. This is such an honor. So here it is, our first children's book, Who's That I Hear? Illustrations by, of course, Julie. One of my favorite quotes is in the front of the book by Dr. Seuss. It goes like this: the more that you read, the more things you will know. The more that you learn, the more places you will go. Bump, scritch, scratch. What's that noise? I heard a sound. Now I'm looking all around. There's something there I just can't see. Please, oh, don't eat me. Mom, help, I need you. Please come quick. I'm telling you, I heard a sound, not way up high, but on the ground. Go back to sleep. It's just the wind. Bump, scritch, scratch. There it is, that sound again, a creature moving, not the wind. I do not think I want to see the great big monster after me. Help, I'm scared. Mom, Dad, come quick. I love that one, Julie. Look, darling dear, there's nothing here. The old floor creaks, so have no fear. Your imagination's tricking you. Now back to sleep, that's what to do. Squeak, peep, squeak, the pitter pat of little feet. There's just one thing we need to do. Listen closely, follow clues. Be brave and hunt for monsters there. Maybe it might be a bear. It's getting louder, louder now. Tiny squeaks, not great big growls. I see it. Wait, that's no nightmare. There are no monsters anywhere. A tiny mouse and family who need a home just like me. A place to be safe, cared for, and warm with people who love you and keep you from harm. Good night, little mouse and your family. Thanks for sharing my room with me. I have to show you the last little mouse.
Oh, thank you, DJ. That was so, and Julie, congratulations to you too, to all of you. What a beautiful book. It's just so great to see that beautiful wash of color on the pages. So DJ, let's start with the story itself. Talk to us about how the story formed in your imagination and what the early influences might have been as you developed it.
It's a great story, actually. I wrote it as a poem for my kids when they were young, and they were going through a phase like a lot of children do, where they would hear bumps in the night and, you know, mom, dad, come help. And so they went through that stage. And actually, I was talking to a friend of mine who might be listening, and she said, I remember you talking about that stage, and they wouldn't sleep the whole night. And so I decided to write them a poem about the experience. And this is actually, I found this little teeny tiny book in a box, and this was what I wrote it in. You can see, maybe not, there's, here's my very, Julie has seen these, my very rough little illustrations of it. Here's my mouse. And so that was it. I wrote it in this little book for my kids. And it wasn't until I think 2 or 3 years ago when it actually came to the surface again. And my husband said, you should publish that poem. It's so sweet. And so that was where the story came from. But as you can probably tell, I really needed illustrator to bring it alive. And that's where my friend Julie came in.
So one of my jobs is to direct Hamlin's MFA in Writing for Children and Young Adults program. And so I know, working with writers for kids, that it takes considerable skill, talent, and effort to write a successful children's book. I think many assume that because a children's book is short and it's for kids, that it's easy to do, that anybody can do it. If I have kids, I can do it, because how hard can it be? It's so short. And the reality is that it's really quite a complicated art form to do it well. There's the whole illustration part, and then there's the text. So talk about the writing process itself. So you started it as a poem. How many drafts did you do before you felt that you had a draft you could show to a publisher?
It took a while. it took a while, because I think you're exactly right, Mary. It seems like it should be so easy, but let's be honest, kids are sophisticated and they know when something sounds right. They know when something attracts their attention. You need to take that responsibility seriously. And so I had the blessing to have Jenny Talman, who you, I'm sure, remember from Hamlin as well, who has edited both of my books, and one that'll be coming out this summer. And she has an ear. She's a poet as well. And so it was very important, the syncopation, that we didn't stumble on words, that it flowed really well. And so Jenny and I went back and forth for quite a while. And there was, when we were getting to the very end, we laid out all of Julie's beautiful illustrations and moved around words and cut them up and put them together and took them apart, just depending on what. The sound was very important, and it just as important as in my poetry book for adults, equally as important in a poetry book for kids.
Yeah, so that you kind of went back and forth between with Jenny and with the illustrator, kind of figuring out where the page breaks would go, where the illustrations would go. And so you and Jenny played with the text. Yes. Together.
Yes.
Because one of the things I really like about it, I like how easy it is to read out loud, and a children's picture book really has to be read well out loud. And I loved the softness of the rhymes, that they're not rote. There's a real fluidity to them, and there's a soft rhyming. It's not always a hard rhyming, which gets a little awkward, and kids pick that up. So sometimes you don't even know it's rhyming, but the kids can hear it, and it creates that rhythm in their ears. So that was well done. And as a poet, so my next question is that you've had considerable success already as a poet, and I imagine you have a lot more poetry to write. So why write a children's book at this point in your life?
I'm not sure I would have gone that route had I not written this book decades ago. But it made perfect sense to me, because people will say, well, why are you veering off and you wrote this book and then now you're doing a children's book? But it's all poetry to me. It's all image based. It's all sound. And it seemed like a very natural thing. I mean, the next book is going back to poetry for adults. So I just go, like Julie, I'm sure too, I just go where the inspiration and my mind takes me. And on any given day, that can be just about anywhere. So it seemed like a natural thing for me to do.
Yeah. So now let's talk about the process of getting the manuscript from the text that you've worked on to book form. And this is where Elisa and her company comes in. So DJ, why don't you talk about how it got started, and then we can bring in Elisa to talk.
It's one of my favorite words is serendipity. And my relationship with both Julie and Elisa has been all about serendipity. I had opened a gallery in downtown Carbondale, Colorado, and it turned out Elisa moved into the building. Correct me, Elisa, if I'm wrong. Moved into the building right across the street. So literally with Homespun Mercies, when we got to the end of it and we were doing, really intense editing, we could run back and forth with the updates. I mean, it was really kind of fun. And so the children's book was the same thing. We gave it to Elisa and thought we had it pretty well set. It was almost one of those things like, okay, we have the illustrations. We've edited the whole book. We're almost there. And thank goodness for Elisa, because that was just the beginning of the process, really. I mean, it was formatting and making decisions. For instance, the first iteration of the book that we received, the back was white. It was totally white and it looked terrible. And so then it was, we need to add some color to that. And then what about the spine? And then where do the different elements of the book go, and the page breaks, what makes sense, the order. And so having somebody like Elisa with an eye for detail and so knowledgeable about what she does, it made the process really fun. It really was a really fun experience to work with her. So, yeah.
So Elisa, talk about it from your point of view. Talk about your role and what it was like working with DJ. So I just want to clarify, had Julie done the illustrations already when Elisa saw it?
Yes. So
Okay.
how it worked was I scanned all of these. Julie, I think I'm getting it right. I sent them to Julie, maybe even through Messenger, and just said, this is what it looks like. And I do want to say something about that. She came back and painted this little guy on the front of the book. And she had no way of knowing that that little guy, and I was going to have the picture, looks exactly like my son. She had never seen a picture of my son, and if I match them up, they look like the same person. So so I gave them to Julie, and then I said, go for it. I sent her the other pages, and Julie and I met a couple of times. So by the time we had Elisa jumped in, the illustrations were done, the editing was done. But that was, like I said, where the story really began of the process of publishing.
Okay, so Julie, I'm going to come back to you, but go ahead, Elisa, talk about.
Thank you. I was just going to say, because DJ and I had worked together on Homespun Mercies, we developed a friendship as well. And I think I remember having coffee with you one morning, and you had some little sketches, and so I was privy to what was going on as it was happening. But by the time I got into the big part of the project, yes, the illustrations were done. But I remember being part of it from the very beginning. And then I also remember a day we had them spread out all over your home office. We had the type and the trying to figure out the right page breaks and which order things should go. And so it's just a really fun process. And in addition to the beauty and the softness of Julie's artwork, we got to play with paper and the colors of and how that was all going to work, and find the right printer. And we work very well together, and came up with something that works. And Homespun Mercies is also very similar in the process that we did together, and back and forth about a lot of different things, and come up with a good system. So.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to you, but now I want to veer off to Julie. So DJ, when you sent Julie the original text, it was more the original, it was the initial poem and some of the sketches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was exactly, I would take a picture of this little teeny tiny page and zip it to Julie and say, what do you think? And I think, Julie, you just started with the cover, as I recall.
Yeah.
The little boy. Yeah.
Yep, the little boy.
Yep.
Yeah.
And once I saw that and knew Julie had exactly the vibe that, Julie and I've talked about this before, about it's so wonderful to listen to. She actually was the boy. I mean, she actually was feeling like, okay, what would this little boy be like? What would he look like when he's calling for his parents? And so I felt once she had that first illustration done, it was like, just go for it, because you've got it already. So.
How did you find Julie in the first place?
Should I tell Julie? Do you remember?
How did you meet?
So that gallery in Carbondale, there was a hair salon, Fiore, I think, right next door.
Fiore. Yep.
And maybe it was First Friday. I was open that night, and First Friday is when the whole community and all businesses stay open and people go from business to business. It's really kind of a fun thing. And this beautiful effervescent woman walked into the gallery, and she's like, "Hi, I'm Julie." And I'm like, "Oh, nice to meet you." And I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "I'm doing a painting party at the salon." And I'm like, "Well, so you're a painter." And she said, "Yeah, I do this and this and this, and obviously very talented." And I said, "Would you ever consider doing a children's book?" And that's how we met. I mean, it was total serendipity. And I've loved her ever since and her
Yeah.
work. So yeah, it was.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great story.
Yeah.
So Julie, talk about your process. So you get these images and you get the poem, the story. And so did you ever have any sense that the narrator was a boy versus a girl? Did he just come? How did he come to you?
I don't know how he came to me. I read the book. It was funny because when DJ sent me the copies of her little book, she has all these little, really cute little pictures and her writing and everything. And he just came to me. I don't know how to explain that when that happens, you know, when you paint an animal or a person and what colors they come to you, but he definitely came to me and that was who he was.
And so then talk about the process of does the book represent all the illustrations you did? Were there others that you decided not to use? How did that work?
I don't think so. I think they're all there, right, DJ, everyone? Because I had the pages and I drew an illustration for each page. So each page had an illustration of the process he went through to finally finding the mice. Yeah.
Well, you know what a lot of people don't know is that one of the kind of signs of a good picture book text is that it not only resonates with the reader, the young reader, and the adult reader reading the story to the young reader, but there's something for the illustrator to work with. You know, often a text in a preliminary draft will go to an illustrator. I mean, a good editor knows this, but it'll go to an illustrator and the illustrator will say, I have nothing to do with this. You've got to do something else with this text. You've got to give me something to work with. So that's great to hear that you once you got this little guy in your mind and he's in bed. So you had him in bed. You know, from the beginning, and he's in his room because he's calling to mom and dad, and then you just kept going.
So yes, I was very lucky because that's happened. Sometimes when you're asked to create a commission or something, people will give you sort of an abstract idea of what they want. For me, it was very easy because DJ she sent me her pages and I literally just took page by page. So yeah, so he was in his room supposed to be sleeping, and like happens sometimes, you hear noises and you're not sure. And so he sort of calls mom and dad, then he calls mom and dad again. Then they sort of, you need to go to bed. And then he decides, wait a minute, there's something more to find here. So he goes and discovers it, which I think is super encouraging. And I'm glad for him because he realized he didn't have to be afraid at all.
Yeah, which is kind of the point of the book or the message that that child who's afraid learns that he or she has agency and can figure out the problem and that it's not as scary a thing as he thought.
Right.
So, you know, he kind of integrates the mice. So, DJ, did you always have the image that it was mice making the noise? Or did that come from Julie?
No, it definitely was always the mice. I mean,
Okay.
you know, I have this little Post-it note of these
Okay.
little rough sketches of mice. So that was always the intention, that it was going to be, that would be what the boy would finally find. Was
Okay.
not as scary as he thought it might be.
Well, I love it. After I read it, I went back again and looked at it again, looking for the little opening on the pages. See, was the mouth, you know, I never saw any mice. And I said, oh, there they are. It's in it's in most of the pages and I just missed it. And now I can go back and see it. So that was great. So once you started the illustrations and you went back and forth, did you change any of the text at that point, DJ, or did it pretty much stay the same?
Any changes we made to the text were had to do with just the rhyme, having, you know, maybe it wasn't quite there like originally it was the pitter patter of little feet, but you stumble on that, right? It's the pitter pat of little feet. So the syncopation or the number of syllables, just like in any kind of poetry, had to be spot on. So that was more of what we did. Jenny and I went back and forth just to be sure that each word in it had significance. You know, some of it maybe was a little wordy, maybe it didn't flow, so we removed some of the, you know, just words, the ands or thes, just to make it flow better. But for the most part, it stayed quite intact.
And you were pretty thrilled with the illustrations. So did you do any changing to the illustrations, or did they remain intact?
You know, we did do, when Elisa and Lisa probably remembers this was one of our many challenges. We had thought about putting borders around. Julie, I'm not sure if you ever saw those borders, and then maybe like a thin black line, and everything seemed to really be boxing it in. Here, Julie had this beautiful art that was flowing on the page, and putting the border around seemed to box it in. So we actually did have Chris Kelman, who's one of the people, he did all of our trailers for the book, which are adorable. He did some softening of the edges, and just because we didn't want her work to be, it just looked too formal. It looked too contained. So now everything just kind of flows off the page. And you feel like as you're reading it, you can imagine Julie sitting down and just painting. And that's the effect we wanted.
How long did it take you, Julie, to do all these illustrations?
That's a tough question to answer. I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, each one probably a few hours, each one, by the time you work them all out in your head and compose them properly. And it, you know, you want his room to look the same in every frame as well.
Yeah.
So you know, you have to make it look like it makes sense from one frame to the other. It can't look like another room. So I worked on them a pretty long time. It was certainly a labor of love, though. I sort of felt like he's a part of me, or I love him. When I look at him, he makes me smile. We spent a lot of time together, him and I.
Yeah. And the parents are great too. I love them.
Yeah.
So Elisa, back to you. So then you get the text in these illustrations, and you've been in on the story and the process a little bit. So what then? You worked hard with DJ on the layout. Talk about then your role in actually putting it together.
Yeah, when I start working with an author, we often have to talk about what's the end result. You know, who's your audience? How do you want to be marketing it? How, you know, all of those things play into how you end up formulating the book from the beginning. So we determined that we were going to be using a traditional printing and not a print on demand with this book. And it was going to be landscape instead of portrait. That was partly determined because of the photos, but also just the way, or the illustrations, I'm sorry, just the way it ended up feeling. You know, working together, finding the right printer, that took some time, getting some samples, working on the color, the typeface. Interesting, it seems to be a typeface that DJ really likes, because we used it in her other book as well. So it just lent itself very nicely to this one. Yeah, and then, you know, I can't remember, we went through, you know, different size, type, and, you know, just like she was talking about with in the beginning, were the illustrations going to bleed off the page? Were they going to be in a box with a frame around them? And, you know, so there was some definite process into all of that. But it all came together. I don't know, DJ, am I forgetting anything?
It's great, yeah. You know, Mary, I wanted to go back, unless you wanted to ask Elisa.
No, go ahead.
I wanted to go back to what you were talking about the child having agency, which is a great, Julie and I talked about that, Elisa and I talked about that, Jenny. There was a book that my son Tom loved when he was young called Monster at the End of This Book, and it was a Sesame Street book. And as if anyone has read it, you remember it because Grover, you know, he's afraid to turn the page because there's going to be that monster, and then there's no monster, and then you get up to it and it happens over and over again. And as a parent, I felt bad about that, because it was like I'm telling him constantly by reading this that there's something to be scared of, there's something to be, you know, I wanted this book to be more about, you talked about agency, but empathy and empowerment. So this little boy wasn't going to rely on his parents like a lot of books do. They just, you know, he needed them to solve it for him. Then there was a discussion, at least in my head, and I can't remember, Julie and Elisa, if we talked about this too, but it was whether or not to have him be a boy or a girl. And to me, it's okay, you know, there's obvious reasons why you would want to do one and maybe not the other. And so I thought it was important that boys that are made to feel like they never should be able to fear anything can act. That's part of who we are growing up. We all have those emotions. And so that was the choice, was to have it be a little boy, because that to me said a lot.
I love that. And I also love the, you know, the kind of developmental steps that he's frightened, he calls mom and she soothes him. And then it happens again, he calls mom and dad, and then they try to reassure him. So the parents are definitely playing a role. You know, they're offering that stability, that love, that comfort. But in the end, it's the boy who said, I better figure this out. I'm going to get down on my hands and knees, got to look for clues. And then he finds out what it is, and it's not so terrible after all. So that is a great way to end this story, you know, for the kid reader and for the parent reader who played a role, but you can only go so far. You can't fix things all the time. You know, the child is left in the dark, and the child has to get used to the dark and sort it out. So I love that message. And that was always part of your vision for it, right, DJ?
Mm-hmm. It really was. And as Julie and I remember that conversation, Julie, in the kitchen, where we talked about, well, where do we see the next book going? I mean, what character, what person do we want to introduce? What do we want to take from our own lives when we were kids, and introduce into the book? And I think that's been a really interesting discussion. And Julie, I hope you don't mind if I say this, but it was great, because I was asking her, I said, well, just show me how you came up with this. So she just starts sketching, you know, and showing me, and you drew a dog, and then all of a sudden she drew a boy, but he wasn't a boy. It was the character in this book, but he was now a grown adult. You could see that he looked kind of the same, but then we started talking about, okay, now maybe the story at some point, books down the road, is about the boy growing up, and now he is, you know, part of the story as a dad. And that I just think is really heartwarming in itself. Julie?
That's great.
Yeah, I think that it's important. To me, I saw him when he was with me, physically with me, was that I wonder what his next challenge would be in his life and how he would solve that, and the next one and the next one and the next one, until he's grown up and has his own kids, and then the cycle starts again.
Yeah.
So one of the questions, maybe my last question for you all, and maybe for Elisa, is now that the book has been launched, and it's out in the world, and it's going to libraries. So what's the plan for it? What happens? What do you do with it? How do you make it all happen after it's originally happened? How do you keep it going?
Right. I mean, for me, it's, as Julie and I were talking about going and doing readings of the book, whether it's libraries, as schools are opening up, going to, you know, elementary schools, to ECFE, parent and child classes to read it, because I think that would serve two purposes. In other words, we want to get the book out into the world. We want parents to see it. We want to get feedback on it. But then we have an opportunity to hear from parents about, oh, maybe during quarantine, wow, we were really going through this with our kids, and that's been really difficult. And so whether we're doing readings in person or on Zoom, we're just open to anyone that wants us to read, because it'll help us to see what subjects we should be talking about or writing about in the future.
Yes.
Great. So let's segue into Owlets and Company, which also has just had a launch. And so talk about what Owlets and Company is and what your vision for it is, DJ.
Oh, it is really interesting because, again, serendipity. Elisa and I, the book was scheduled to launch August. Had we talked about August, I think, of 2020, Elisa?
Yeah, August or September or something like that.
Right. And then there was this thought of, we were really in the thick of quarantine. No one was really knowing, what was going to happen. Kids, I really felt for parents, my kids and their spouses and grandkids, because it was, well, are we going to be in class? Maybe we're in class for a day and then we're not. And so we kind of put the book on hold, because I guess for me, I felt like, yes, a book is a wonderful thing. And I'm so proud of this book, as I know all of you are, but it was like, there was something more we needed to explore, or something more that we felt we could do for parents and kids right now. I mean, especially right now, but in the future. And there's a whole lot of kids having a hard time, and there's a whole lot of parents having a hard time. And so we thought, what if, my husband hears this all the time, but I say, wonder if, and he always knows when I say wonder if, he goes, oh, here it comes, right? Wonder if we created something more, like a website or some support for parents and kids and their families, and that could be a place, a safe space where kids could go and they could, have coloring pages, they could have games, we could have resources, we could have story time. And it's just a place where the kids could log in. Maybe mom and dad are making dinner and they need 5 minutes a break, and they could visit. And so we started tossing around name ideas, and I found on the internet these pictures of these two cute owlets, and I was like, oh, that's adorable. And then I'm like, wait a minute, Julie, do you do owls? Do you do owlets? And she's like, of course, I'll do owlets. And so once we had Owlets and Company, and then Julie did the painting, and then you come up with a logo, which was so exciting. I mean, it just all happens. So, Julie, once we saw your illustrations, it's like, oh, that's it. That's, there are owlets, there are kids that we're going to be talking to, right?
Yeah.
And just their sweet little eyes and faces. And then I know she's in on this call, but she's not a participant. Christine Russo, another Hamlin, talented Hamlin grad. She is our web designer. She did my writer's website, and I started sending her things. And of course, we scored with Christine because she loves owlets and she loves ampersands. So she was in, and then
She does love ampersands.
it just kind of went from there. So then it was, okay, what are the tabs going to be? What do we want to include? What kind of fun things do we want to have? So it really was like this little, like the little engine that started up the hill really slow, and then we started gaining momentum, and now we're really excited with where it can go and what it can do in the world.
Well, I encourage our listeners to check it out. I think Alex posted the website, and it's a wonderful interactive website. The book is on it, and you've already got some illustration games and interactive games, and there's going to be a newsletter and lots of more things coming. And Christine Rosu, So It Goes Design, is her company. She's brilliant, amazing, and she does just the most incredible websites, and she's really affordable. So there you go with Christine, and Jenny as editor. So Alex, I know that our listeners have probably been sending you questions through the chat, and I've facilitated a chat before, and it's kind of challenging because some are just comments and some are questions. So do you want to You know, if you've got, do you have questions you can
We
read?
do. We have some questions in our Q&A, which makes it really easy. You might
Good.
have gone over these through the conversation, but I didn't want to overlook them. So I will ask them, and most of them are for DJ, some for Julie. So feel free to answer. So the very first question we got is, what inspired you to write this book?
Life. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about poetry is, and Mary Oliver was just the shining example of that. We have subject matter all around us every day. I mean, you could sit down right now and stare at something in the room you're in and say, I'm gonna write a little something about that. It may be good, it may not be good. Who cares? I mean, you're just experiencing things around you. And what I love about doing that is you start paying attention to life. You start paying attention to the little things. So when my kids were having a hard time, Tom and Angela and Maggie, when they were having a hard time sleeping and imagining things at night and getting up, that was enough inspiration to write a poem, and which became a book. So that's where it originated.
That's great. I have another question, and this is, do you hope to write more children's books with the same character?
Ooh.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is just the tip, the tip of the iceberg. Julie and I have talked about this. He has so many adventures in him. And as he takes children along on these adventures, they too are going to be empowered, and they're going to experience, empathy. And absolutely. Julie, what do you think?
Oh, yeah. He has a whole life of challenges and victories to be had and questions to be answered and adventures and fun for sure.
Awesome. And would you ever write a poetry book for kids?
That's a really good question. We went to the campus of Stanford College, oh gosh, a year or two ago. And I'm so disappointed. When you see a book you love, buy it. Don't wait, because you may go back or you may forget the title. And it was a beautiful book of children's poetry. Now, people have told me, well, I would never buy a book of children's poetry, but who cares? I mean, I think it's beautiful. Most of the people who read Who's That I Hear don't realize it's a poem. It's a long poem. It's just a kid's story, and it sounds good to the ear. And but it's a poem. And so absolutely, and thank you for asking that, because it makes me kind of want to do that now, and I love a good challenge. So if Julie's up for it, I'm up for it. At least
I'm up for it.
Yeah.
So great. And this last question, you kind of went over a little bit, but they're asking about the whole process. How long did this take to write and illustrate from, day one to the finished product?
Gosh, I mean, we're talking decades ago that I wrote this. So I have, I don't know, as a mom of 3 young kids, I don't know if I was up nights, writing this, or if I just jotted it down at one time. Definitely publishing it took a lot longer than that. I'm thinking, Elisa and Julie, help me with this. I'm thinking a couple years between the time we started, and what do you think?
For sure. I would say, COVID figured in this as well, but I think you and I've been in Vail for 3 years now. So yeah, it's been I would say 3 years maybe. Wow.
Wonderful. And this question is for Julie. So Julie, is watercolor your favorite medium, or how did you guys decide on that for this book?
Yes, I am a watercolorist. I paint with other mediums, acrylic, not oil. But yes, I'm a watercolorist, and that is my favorite medium. And I think it has a lot of feeling and a lot of movement and a lot of transparency, and it's sort of enlightened a little bit. And I thought, especially for kids, it's my favorite medium and what I buy as an adult artist and art collector. But yeah, he definitely needed to be light, yeah.
Right. And one more question. How many copies of the book are there? I'm guessing they're asking how many books were part of this initial launch. How many copies?
Oh gosh, that's I think 1,500. I want to say 1,500. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. And I have one comment that I'd like to mention from our chat, which was very interesting, with this book. Somebody mentioned that it's interesting that the character is a boy. Interesting point is that boys are conditioned to not admit fear. And can you talk about that for the subject of this book?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it happens to girls and it also happens to boys. And so as we were having the conversation about should this be a boy or girl, in my heart, I always felt it was going to be a boy, but I really did have to think carefully about the implications of choosing one over the other, because I really think it's out there that little boys shouldn't, they're supposed to be tough. They're not supposed to fear anything. I think that's so unfair, because we're human and we all have things we fear and we all have things we love and we all have things, all of those emotions. And so for me, it was really important to break those barriers of, we're not going to typecast our main character, right? We're not going to typecast this. We're going to say, little boys, yes, we understand that. Little girls, yes, we understand that. But that was really important to me. And if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free.
I mean, we did talk about that. We had several conversations, and the character came to me as a boy, and it wasn't, and DJ never said to me, this was written for, I mean, she said, I wrote this for my kids. So that wasn't, but yeah, we had that conversation and he came, this is how he came to us.
And yet there's something almost androgynous about him. I mean, he's a boy, but because of the colors and the subject matter and the language, any child, any gender child could read this and appreciate it. As kids get a little older and you're moving into older kids lit, it gets a little bit more, there's some more gender distinctions, that this is more of a boys book, more of a girls book, not as much as there used to be, thank God. There still is. And yet this is, and now you'll see there are a lot more books written with girl protagonists, trying to make up, I think, for all those classic books that had more boy protagonists. So things are evening out, but I love that this is a boy who has to deal with his fear, and he's a very gentle boy, I think. There's something about him that's very winning, and yet he's courageous. So I think this would appeal to any child.
Yeah. And I like that. I like that, the way that Julie painted the characters and, even laid out his room and did that, because I agree with you, Mary. I don't think it has those strong stereotypical, I just don't think it's like in your face that this is about this one person, boy or girl. I hope the kids will read it and they'll see themselves in the character. And there's going to be a little sister or a neighbor or a cousin, and she's just going to be a little spitfire. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah.
I also hope those mice stay part of the story. I keep thinking of Katie Camillo's Tale of Despero, where you've got the mice playing such a role and becoming characters in the story. And these mice, or even Cinderella, with the mice. I just think of these mice as having some potential. The Beatrix Potter books, all the animals, and the children coming to life in the house. There's just so much potential in there.
I have to tell you a funny story, Julie. I'm not sure if I've ever told you this. This particular page that's at the end of the book where the mice are asleep and they're laying on their back. My husband likes to refer to that as a picture of him on Thanksgiving. After he's had the Thanksgiving meal, he's looking a little bit like this. loves that. That's his favorite illustration of the whole.
That's great. That's great.
Bob, he's great.
And I
Well,
wanted to, Mary, I wanted to, just for a second, if I could go back to owlets. One of the reasons, the videos that we're working on that I told you about in the introduction, we wanted to, I am such a huge fan of Fred Rogers. I mean, he was an amazing man and gentle spirit. And I love the videos he used to do with kids and the way he would approach subject matter that at the time might have been controversial or might have been something happening in that day. And I don't think even the parents knew that that's what he was doing, but he got his point across. And so that's the videos that we'll be doing for Owlets in the World videos is
great.
really paying tribute to Fred Rogers, because he was just such a wonderful influence in so many of our lives. So I wanted to get that in there.
Well, and I wanted to encourage you to, back to that. There's such an overlap between children's book prose and poetry. I know this because of our program where children's book writers come to learn, and they're taught by, other writers who write for kids, and many of them are children's book authors. And they're all poets in some ways, because the rhythm of the language and the rhyme and the internal rhymes, kids love that. It creates a predictability, a stability, and a beauty for kids that really works. But then I just wanted to throw out Joyce Sidman, another Minnesota writer who's a marvelous poet. So she writes poetry for children. So it's clearly poetry. Whereas I think it's not clear if it's poetry or prose. It's just this beautiful mix of the two of them. But you should look at her work, DJ, because she clearly angles for poetry, and they're beautiful. And I think that there's some symbiosis between you and Joyce.
Wonderful. I'll look forward to reading that. That sounds amazing.
Good. So Alex, I don't know, are we out of time?
we're getting there. This was wonderful to see. I'm very happy you guys were here, but we are running on the end of the hour. And I hope to have you again, DJ, Julie, everybody. Thank you again, Elisa and Mary, for leading the conversation today. And thank all of our attendees. I think we have a raised hand. So for these last minutes, I'm going to go ahead and turn off recording and invite our participants, if they'd like to speak with us and our panelists, just raise your hand and I will permit you to talk. I am turning off recording now, and those who are wanting to join the conversation on screen are free to do so.